everyone, this is O talking about the introduction to George Orwell's 1984, your new book that you're going to read this week. So, a little bit about the author. This is just reiteration of information that was on a slide in the previous lesson. He wrote one of the essays that you guys got to choose from, so this is just a review of that slide. So, George Orwell is not his real name. His real name is Eric Arthur Blair, and he was born in India, where his father was stationed as a British official. When he was younger, he got a scholarship to this prestigious high school, Eton, in England, but he couldn't financially continue his education at Oxford or Cambridge University, where a lot of those students from that high school would go to, but he couldn't afford it. So he worked for the Imperial Police in Burma, now Myanmar, which provided much material for his earlier work. It also led to his dislike of imperialism, which he expresses in his essay, Shooting an Elephant. If you read that essay, you would be familiar with his feelings towards imperialism. He was also a socialist, so he was angered by social political systems that undermined human freedom, which, in his point of view, were fascism, capitalism, and Stalinism. You might be surprised to see capitalism on that list, but if you're taking a look at what's going on today, our capitalist society is not doing so well with the people who are disadvantaged socially and economically during this pandemic. So there are some downsides to capitalism, and so Orwell was a critic of that. In fact, his two best-known novels, Animal Farm and 1984, were attacks on Soviet-style totalitarianism. He became one of the most widely admired English essayists and notable novelist and critic. So a little bit about Orwell's beliefs. So Orwell was a person who had a reputation for standing apart and even making a virtue of his detachment. This outsider position often led him to oppose the crowd. So whatever everyone else was believing, and he kind of believed something different that made him stand out. His beliefs about politics were affected by his experiences fighting the Spanish Civil War, a terrible conflict between fascist nationalists and the Republican government, which involved many different extreme political viewpoints, especially since the fascist nationalists were supported by Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, and the Republican government was more favored by the British and the French. So you had those two different opposing ideas of communism and fascism versus capitalism and republicanism, with the French and the British supporting the other side. So it was quite interesting, the Spanish Civil War. People throughout Europe would volunteer to fight for the Spanish in this war, and that's what George Orwell did, seeing that a fascist government was going to take over Spain. He volunteered to fight against that. He viewed socialists, communists, and fascists as repressive and self-serving. He was skeptical of governments and their willingness to forsake ideas in favor of power. So he didn't like governments that weren't open to new ideas, especially if those ideas maybe undermined their power. He thought that was wrong. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about George Orwell's other novel, Animal Farm, because it'll give us an idea of what George Orwell writes about, and Animal Farm is considered a classic novel in our day and age, so we're going to take a little look at it. So Animal Farm is a masterpiece of political satire about oppressed individuals who long for freedom but ultimately are corrupted by assuming the very power that had originally oppressed them. So if you remember what satire is when you use fiction to ridicule, make fun of current events, current ideas, current people, again, through the use of fiction. And Animal Farm does that. It traces the deplorable conditions of mistreated animals who can speak and who exhibit many human characteristics. After extreme negligence by their owner, the animals revolt and expel Mr. Jones and his wife, the owners, from the farm. The Society of Animals then form a totalitarian regime, which scholars interpret as Orwell's critique of the communist system in Soviet Union. So again, it's a satire of that communist system. All right, so let's take a look at what's this story about. So how George Orwell kind of got the idea for this book is that he once saw a little boy whipping a horse, and he wrote, "It struck me that if only such animals became aware of their strength, we should have no power over them, and that men exploit animals in much the same way as the rich exploit the worker." If you take a look at some of the companies in our country right now in this pandemic crisis, we have, people having to work these essential jobs but aren't really getting much compensated for it in certain companies. So again, there's some truth in what he's saying here. When it was first published, it was actually shelved among children's books in stores to Orwell's horror. He traveled from store to store, frantically requesting that it be moved to the adult section. And so this book has developed this dual identity of being both a children's story and an adult satire that has lasted for over 50 years. It's probably the reason why I read it in 8th grade instead of in high school. But so it has this kind of weird dual identity as something that a child would read and something as older adults would read. All right, so its significance today, because of its power of allegory, makes its significance. So allegory is when you have a story that tells deeper meaning through usually symbolism. And so since we have animal characters, Animal Farm is an allegorical fable, and it makes us then make connections and comparisons to real life, and can be meaningful to any reader in any historical period, because usually symbols in allegories haven't changed much over time, and so a lot of different people can understand what those symbols mean despite being years later. The story of Animal Farm can teach us many lessons about the ways power can be abused and used to manipulate others. Orwell's chilling story of the betrayal of idealism through tyranny and corruption is as fresh and relevant today as it was when it was first published. So a lot of points what he makes in this novel are true about a lot of different totalitarian or dictatorship countries or governments. All right, so here are some of the symbolism in George Orwell's Animal Farm. So we're looking at which characters symbolize which real person or idea. So we have Napoleon the pig. He starts the rebellion with the animals and becomes their leader, and then becomes a tyrannical, basically tyrannical dictator. So he represents Stalin. Stalin rose to power in a very similar way during the Russian Revolution. Then we have Farmer Jones, the irresponsible owner of the farm, who doesn't treat his animals very well, but then has these random acts of kindness towards his animals. And he represents Tsar Nicholas II, who was in power before the Russian Revolution. The whole revolution was to depose the Russian royalty. Makes sense that the farmer who gets kicked out of his farm represents Tsar Nicholas, who also gets kicked out of his position of rule. Then we have Snowball the pig, another rebel leader who was later chased out. He represents Leon Trotsky, who was also driven away by Lenin's KGB. So if you remember in our modernism notes that Lenin came to power after the end of the Russian Revolution, and so Since Leon Trotsky was someone who was fighting for the revolution, believed in its ideas, believed in making a better Russia, but when he saw that Lenin created this more totalitarian government, he didn't agree with it, and so he was driven away as an enemy by Lenin's KGB. So Snowball has a similar role in Animal Farm, representing someone who's fought for the rebellion but disagreed with the outcome, and so is kicked out. Then we have Old Major the Pig. He also starts a rebellion, but he does it with his words and his ideas of animalism, but he dies before the rebellion actually gets started, and so he represents Karl Marx, who wrote the Communist Manifesto, basically created the idea of communism, but he died before he could see it be applied in the Russian Revolution. So animalism has very similar notions as communism. The whole idea is to make everyone equal and fair, right? No rich but no poor, better life for the worker. All animals are equal in this story. Everyone owns the farm, very similar to what communism principles are. But if you recall from the previous slides, there was that quote that all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. So over time, after the revolution in this book, what was fought for, right, this equality and shared ownership of the farm, deteriorates into a totalitarian regime.